Good evening, everybody, and you're all very welcome to Limerick City and County Council's 15th Greenleaf webinar. We're delighted to welcome you all here today to participate in Let's Talk Climate Action Workshop. We're delighted that Gavin is here with us, Gavin Harte. Gavin is a seasoned environmental campaigner who is adept at bringing people together to focus on climate action, and I will hand over to Gavin now. Thank you, Gavin.
Thank you, Sinead. Hope you can all hear me, everybody. Delighted to be with you in Limerick, albeit virtually. But hopefully the talk will be of some interest to you. It's certainly not my job to tell you what to do. So yes, the talk is about climate action, but it's not my job to tell you what to do. It's my job, I suppose, to try and switch you on to the idea of actually taking climate action. So I'm going to cover a whole range of things. I'm going to look at the science of climate. I think it's very important that there is consensus on the science, and that allows us to act. In other words, it gives us, I suppose, the knowledge as to why we need to act. I'm going to look at, I suppose, when we get that part of it covered, into the area, the more cultural side of it, and looking at our carbon bubble, our sort of emissions on a per capita and also on an individual basis. And I'm going to look at the link of climate justice, so why it's so important to look at this from the point of view of equity. And then I wanted to look at, I suppose, the emotional side of the story. Why is this important? Why is this something that we need to connect with beyond just the facts? And then I'd like to conclude, I suppose, with the reasons why we need to change and how all of this stuff fits together in the context of sustainable development. So that's a general picture as to what I'm going to talk to you about today. I hope it's of interest to you. So I wanted to start off with the science, and it's a critical part, really. I want to introduce you to the reason why all this is happening. This molecule here, carbon dioxide, it's a greenhouse gas along with a bunch of other greenhouse gases. There's a basket of greenhouse gases, water vapor, nitrous oxide, chlorofluorocarbons. They all have this ability to hold heat. But it's really important that we start off with the understanding of the science, the chemistry, the physics of all of this. Because I think until we understand that, we're kind of sort of, why bother doing anything about it? But the science is actually relatively simple and has been understood now for about 200 years. I want to just show you a quick experiment that will really, I suppose, nail this. The complexity kicks in afterwards, I suppose, when we start to take this scientific reality and see how it plays out in the real world, in our society, our economy, and in the natural environment.
I can show you how carbon dioxide affects Earth's climate using this heat-sensitive or infrared camera, which is purring away here, and a candle, this glass tube, which is hooked up to this rather large canister of carbon dioxide gas. Now, if I light the candle, you'll see that on the monitor, the camera picks up the flame perfectly. Look at that. The hottest parts are glowing white. Now watch what happens when I turn on the carbon dioxide.
Just keep your eye on the flame.
The gas is invisible, so you don't see it fill in the tube. But as it comes in, you should see the candle start to disappear. There it goes. Look at that. What's happening is that the carbon dioxide in the tube is effectively trapping the heat.
The candle's warmth no longer reaches the camera. Instead, it's absorbed by the carbon dioxide inside the tube.
So that's the chemistry, that's the science, really. I'm just going to run through that with you again quickly. We have a tube that's full of normal air. On one side, we have a camera that can pick up heat. On the other side, we have a candle that's giving off heat. Under normal circumstances, the heat from the candle passes through the tube and the camera can see it. But then we flood the tube with carbon dioxide. What happens? The heat from the candle can now no longer pass through to the camera on the other side. Why? Because the carbon dioxide in the tube is effectively grabbing and holding that heat. And as a result, the temperature of the air in that tube has gone up by a tiny amount. That's the chemistry. That's the physics, the science of climate change. And it's really simple when we see it in that context. Now, I'll be referring back to this experiment a couple of times over the course of our talk today, but I think it's really important that we start off from that place and understanding that this is chemistry, this is physics. It's not something to believe in like the tooth fairy or Santa Claus. It's chemistry, it's how the world works. The other big part of this is what's called the carbon cycle. Think of this like our planet breathing. So our planet takes in one enormous breath of carbon dioxide in the summertime. And that's why all this growth you can see in the Northern Hemisphere comes on in spring and summer, and then in autumn and winter it dies away. This is our planet breathing in carbon dioxide and breathing out carbon dioxide, 2 giant breaths every year. So this is the carbon cycle. This is the stuff of life. There may well be an atom of carbon in you that was once in a dinosaur. It's the very behind that carbon cycle is the reason why there's life on this planet. So you can see those breaths in and out, carbon dioxide out into the atmosphere in winter, breathing in carbon dioxide in the summer. We see though in this an underlying trend, and this blue line is the year-on-year increase in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That is essentially our scientists turning on the tap, and that's what we have done since the Industrial Revolution. And if you take a look at human history back over the last 10,000 years or so, really since the last ice age, you can see that that blue line has been going up steadily and slowly until a point in and around the 1700s, the Industrial Revolution. James Watt invents his steam engine. We really turn up that tap. We flood the atmosphere with CO2. Now it's gone up by over 40% in that really short period of time. We can't smell it. We can't taste it. We can't see it. Carbon dioxide is invisible to us, really. But if we could smell carbon dioxide, everyone would be saying, my God, the place stinks. That's how much we've changed the chemistry of the atmosphere in a really short period of time. Now, we have to go back about 5 million years to find an equivalent period of time where the Earth was at this concentration, 410 parts per million. 5 million years, we were still, with our primate cousins. There was no humans on the planet as we know them back then. And that was only for a very short period of time. So really, we are experimenting with the atmosphere, unprecedented experiment. This is unknown, really, what we're doing, because 5 million years ago, well, the world was about 2 degrees warmer than it is now, and sea levels were about 15 meters higher than they are now. So a radically different world at a comparable level of CO2 in the atmosphere as we have today. So we really are in uncharted territory. This greenhouse effect that we're playing with, the world before the Industrial Revolution at 280 parts per million, the world now with that 410 parts per million. The sun's energy still comes in, heats the surface of our planet. That heat must go back out into space. That's the way it works to find energy balance. But on the way out now, that heat is being captured by the extra CO2 in the atmosphere. And that's why our world has warmed by 1.1 degrees centigrade since James Watt invented his steam engine. This is the greenhouse effect. This is the chemistry and science of climate change. If we take a look at that warming going back since 1850 or 1870 or so, we can see the world moving from blue to bright red in that 150 years. A phenomenal transformation in the temperature of our planet. 1.1 degree mightn't seem like an awful lot, but if you had a temperature of 1.1 degree tonight, you probably wouldn't have come to this seminar. But that's how much our world has warmed in that really short period of time. And look how it has changed in that 150 years, that increase of over 40% of CO2 in the atmosphere. The trouble with this, though, is that while scientists are quite convinced, and I suppose the general scientific consensus now, 97% of all climate papers stating a position on human-caused global warming agree that global warming is happening and that humanity are the cause. We just have to take a look at the number of peer-reviewed papers in this space. And again, the argument isn't there. There is no counterpoint of view within the scientific community. Where we see the counterpoint of view is within politics and within general population, where only about 55% of the general population think that there is this solid scientific consensus. So if we put that another way, imagine you're not feeling well. Imagine you're feeling a pain in your chest, and you go around, to 100 friends. 45 of them say, you're grand, don't worry about it. 55 say, maybe you should get that checked out. You might stay at home, you might not do anything about it. But if 100 of your friends were all doctors and only 3 of them said, there's nothing to worry about, it would be a very different story. And that's how it is with climate change. From a cultural point of view, 45 people out of 100 aren't convinced of the scientific consensus. But in the scientific community, 97%, and it's more than that in truth, 97% are saying that the consensus is solid. I will strongly support that we are all entitled to our own opinion, but you're most definitely not entitled to your own facts. And the facts now on this case are so robust. We know more about the facts and science of climate change than we do the facts and science of smoking. And everyone is quite comfortable with the idea that smoking is bad for your health. Think of it like the dinosaurs back, 65 million years ago. The people who don't get climate change now, who don't get the science, don't understand how the world works. They don't believe in asteroids. It's that simple. We need to move beyond the scientific debate, is it, isn't it, and into the question of what are we going to do about it. This cultural challenge is very well represented by some scientific studies that have been carried out between researchers in the UK and in the US, where they have been measuring the number of newspaper articles on global warming since about 2004. And what we see is a really, I suppose, quite concerning fact. Well, first of all, the number of articles since 2004 and 2020 are comparable. It's kind of like a fashion story. When we take a look at the total global coverage of climate action and climate stories in Europe over that period of time, we see it popping up. It becomes a fashion item when Al Gore releases a movie or when there's a conference in Paris. These are when we see the thing starting to pick up in interest, but it falls away again. So from a cultural point of view, climate action and climate change is not on our radar. It's not something that we take seriously. And again, if we take a look at this graph and compare it to the other emergency that's going on at the moment, our emergency with regard to COVID, we see the huge fall off in climate coverage as a result that it has been replaced by the COVID story. And the truth is that the COVID emergency has its roots in our environmental degradation of natural environments and viruses jumping from species because we're moving into areas of nature where really, I suppose, we're having a huge impact. So to see the COVID emergency as separate from the climate emergency, we're missing a really important part of the jigsaw. So back to that molecule, carbon dioxide. Well, we all have a carbon bubble, and that is a part and parcel of this greenhouse effect. But I want to go around it one more time. Human activities are changing the chemistry of the climate system. This is causing changes in the climate, which has major threats to our economy, our society, and the natural environment. Pretty much everything we do, but principally the burning of fossil fuels and the changing of land use and all of the associated activities are releasing those greenhouse gases that we saw, turning up the tap that we saw in the experiment, which is enhancing the greenhouse effect and driving the carbon cycle. This is causing our climatic system to change. So we're seeing changes in cloud cover, the salinity of our oceans, ocean currents, all of these things, temperatures, melting snow and ice. And that change in our climate poses major threats to our economy, our society, and the natural environment. So what started off as a very simple science experiment, the chemistry of CO2, here we see the complexity. Here we see the potential for politics, for vested interests, for the really difficult story that we face shifting into action. How do we take that chemistry and move it into our society, our economy, and into our understanding of the natural environment? This slide shows you or represents the complexity of the system. It is overarching. It affects everything that we do. In Ireland, climate change is seen as a relatively important issue. So within Irish society, we have about 30% of people who see climate change as a critically important story. 30% is still relatively little, really, when we think of it in the context of the importance of the issue. You know, I think that, again, this is seen perhaps in the challenges of the cultural response, those newspaper stories, the lack of it becoming something that we talk about in pubs or in our houses, amongst friends. It hasn't got there yet. It's not an issue of general discourse. So I want to talk now about our carbon bubble. I suppose the amount of carbon that each of us produces. In Ireland, according to the Central Statistics Office, each of us here in Ireland produces approximately 13.5 tons of CO2 per person per year. So we're second only to Estonia and to Luxembourg in our emissions per capita. Ireland is definitely at the high end amongst our European partners. And when I say 13.5 tons, that number is flexible. The CSO, for example, they ignore imports. So products made in China that we import don't add up to our 13.5 tons. Aviation is also excluded from those numbers. So that's another factor. So I like to say that really the Irish per capita emissions is probably closer to about 15 or 16 tons per person per year if we take in those external emissions. And it's very important that we see this in the entirety of the story, because it is a totally interconnected world. But just going at that 13.5 tons per person per year, we're still well above our fair share of the global average. In China, the average person emits about 6 tons per person per year. In Asia, that could be as low, and Africa could be as low as 1 and 2 tons per person per year. In the United States, it's up to 22, 23 tons per person per year. So this is the general capture. This is the general picture per capita emissions per person. So what does a ton of carbon look like? Well, if you were able to see it, a ton of carbon would be about the size of one semi-detached house. So each of us is responsible for 13.5 or 15 of these, whichever number you want to go with. That's 15 houses per year. We can't see it, we can't taste it, we can't smell it, so we kind of ignore it. But every single thing that we do, from how we communicate, how we eat, how we build our homes, how we transport ourselves, all of these individual actions add up collectively to bring us to that 13.5, 15 tons per person per year. Everything, even you sitting here watching me tonight on your computer, has a carbon bubble imprint. We need to understand, we need to be able to measure. And if we just take one example, something like transport, if we compare the amount of emissions between a bus, a car, and a bicycle, we start to get an idea as to where these emissions are coming from. So 24 kilograms if you travel 250 kilometers by bus, about 60 kilograms if you travel 250 kilometers by car, or just 4 kilograms if you travel those 250 kilometers by bicycle. We need to start to measure. This idea of a carbon bubble, a carbon budget, is something we need to really start to embrace and make it part of our day-to-day decision making. In Ireland, our emissions are going in the wrong direction. We have commitments with our European partners to make a reduction in emissions over time, but unfortunately that is tracking in the wrong way. And this is an important thing to understand. It is a huge challenge for most countries in the world to decouple emissions. That means separate emissions from economic growth. We find that those two things are often connected. And when our economy starts to grow, our emissions also grow with it. So this is part of, I suppose, another element of the challenges that we face. How do we decouple our economy from our CO2 emissions? So again, what does a ton of carbon look like? Well, if you were to see it in a spherical form, that's roughly what it would look like. And each of us, Ireland collectively releases about 160,000 tons of those carbon bubbles every day. So imagine here we have Ireland's emissions for one day piled up down by Poolbeg Power Station in Dublin. 365 of those dumped around the country every year. That's what our collective emissions would look like if we could see them. So it's really important that we start to relate to this. We can no longer ignore our emissions. We have to own them. We can't continue to use the atmosphere as a sewer for our carbon emissions. We need to get from that 15 tons per person per year down to about 1 ton by 2050. That is a massive transformation in our society, in our economy, and we need to do it rapidly. It really is an enormous challenge. It's not plugging your mobile phone charger out or changing your light bulbs to LEDs. This is a transformational change in the way we run and function our society. And we all need to be part of it. We all need to join that journey collectively. Now, up to now, I've been looking at a per capita story, the average across a population. But that's not a fair representation because in truth, the emissions are coming from one sector. Predominantly, and this is fascinating research from the University of Leeds in the UK, where they measured emissions against expenditure, available expenditure. So basically the top 5% of wealth in the UK and the poorest 5% in the UK, there's a 700% difference in emissions between those two groupings from the top to the bottom. The poorest people are producing 700% less carbon than the richest. And that's not a surprise. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised. While, the richest people may be buying the electric car or whatever, they're also going on airplane holidays or, this is the climate justice story. And it's very clear now, and economists would have a fairly good rule of thumb that as your income increases by about 10%, well, your emissions are increasing by about 9%. So there's a very close tie between inequality in a society and carbon emissions. And we know that instinctively at a global level. I mean, we all know that people living in sub-Saharan Africa or in Asia, that their emissions are way, way lower than somebody living in the United States. But the truth is that 2 billion people emit less than 2 tons of CO2 per year. That's a quarter of the world's population producing less than 2 tons of CO2 per person per year. And again, economists have a very reasonable take on, a kind of a ratio for this. It's called the 50-10 ratio. And it basically says that 10% of the world's population is producing 50% of total CO2 emissions. And 50% of the world's population is producing less than 10% of total emissions. So it really is also a climate justice issue. And this is something that, organizations like Concern or the Mary Robinson Foundation would be really pointing to. Here in the developed world, we are the responsible parties. It's the rich are producing the most when it comes to global emissions of CO2. And yet the poor are the people who are going to experience the most negative impacts of climate change. And let's remember also that carbon emissions are historical. And here's a really interesting fact. When you take a look, just 90 companies are responsible for 2/3 of total emissions. So if you added up all the carbon emissions that have gone into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, just 90 companies are responsible for 2/3 of all those emissions. And unsurprisingly, they're coming from the fossil fuel and the cement sector, coal, oil, gas, and cement. That's where the vast majority of emissions are coming from. Now, it's very easy to point the finger and go, it's their fault, but that's not fair. We've all benefited from the boom of fossil fuels. The transformational effect that fossil fuels have had on our societies in the last 150 years has been unprecedented. You don't have to go that far back. Maybe one of our grandparents might remember a very different world where fossil fuels were not such a dominant force that they are now. But it all points to one thing, and that is that we currently stand at a very important crossroads. It's absolutely essential that we change direction. We can't maintain a business as usual scenario, because if we do, if we carry on as we're going, it's as likely as not that we will exceed 4 degrees of warming by the end of this century. Now, I mentioned earlier on, I said 1.1 degree. If you had a temperature of about 1.1 degree, you wouldn't have come to this talk tonight. If you had a temperature of 4 degrees above normal, you'd be in hospital. They'd be struggling to bring your temperature down and keep you alive. That's the critical sort of world that we're headed to if we allow the world to warm by 4 degrees by the end of this century. It really is an unprecedented crossroads that we're at. So to keep temperatures, as defined under the Paris Agreement, below 2 degrees or below, we need to reduce emissions. This is to keep us at 2 degrees, which isn't deemed to be the safest. In fact, 1.5 is deemed to be the safest. But just to keep them below 2 degrees, we need to reduce emissions by 25% by 2030 and get to zero by 2070. Or if we want to create, a safer world, 1.5 degrees of warming, we need to cut emissions by 45% in the next 10 years and get to zero by 2050. But we're headed towards a world of 4.5 degrees. That's where we're going. And we're likely to exceed 2 degrees of warming by 2050. So within 30 years, our world is knocking at the very dangerous door if we carry on business as usual. We're told we have to keep at 1.5 degree. That's aggressive mitigation. That's the 45% reduction by 2030 to zero by 2050. That, folks, is climate action. That's the story I suppose we need to take on board. That's the message we need to understand. Here in Ireland, we're already experiencing the negative impacts of climate change. Our average temperature has gone up by just about 1.1 degrees, so we're bang on the global average for our warming here in this country, and that's because we're probably next to a large heat sink. The Atlantic Ocean gives us a buffering impact, so the temperature increase here has been, I suppose, tempered by that oceanic effect. But on the other side, our location challenges us with regards to rainfall, because as the atmosphere warms, it will hold more moisture and we're likely to experience more extreme wet and rainfall. And in fact, climate scientists here suggest that the past 10 years have been Ireland's wettest in nearly 300 years. So again, that's where we need to look out. Rainfall and extreme rainfall events could be something that we have to and will experience much more regularly here in this country. So this really is, I suppose, for me, it's an emotional story, because right now we're facing our greatest threat in thousands of years. Climate change is that threat. And I suppose, what do we do with that? How do we take that? I can communicate the information, I can communicate the facts, and I can communicate the science, but until we decide to do something about it, until we decide to emotionally, I suppose, connect with that information and make a change in our life, similar to that ad, do you remember the one around cigarette smoking where a man is sitting in his hospital bed and his daughter runs in and she looks at him and he kind of goes, he gets it, he knows that he must give up the cigarettes. That emotional connection, that reason to change, that's where we're at. For me personally, the motivation to try and change my behavior comes with being a parent. I decided to become a parent very late in life. So I've got a boy who's 8 years old, and it goes like that. Anyone who has children knows how fast 10 years go. And that's where we need to be getting 25% to 45% reduction in emissions by 2030. That's just 10 years. Are we doing anything about it? Are we serious about that kind of journey that we need to head down? Or are we putting it off? Are we kind of just brushing it out? We can't do that, because the youth get it. Young people know that this train crash is coming down the tracks. They see it coming. We have to be honest with them. We have to engage with their absolutely genuine demand for us to change direction. We had 20,000 kids turned out pre-COVID in Dublin, an unprecedented turnout. And these kids get it. They understand why we need to do something about it. But let's remember, they are also receiving the diet of just, 32 articles in the Irish Times about climate action in August 2020. They are in the society, they're stuck by the bind, but they also get the reason for change. And I think as adults, it beholds on us to join with them because, nature is not something separate from ourselves or just a setting in which we live. We are the elements of the earth and kin to all life. And if we ignore that very simple fact, we ignore a very important part of reality. I defy anyone to take a look at that image and not be in awe of the natural world in which we live. There is reason enough alone to transform and change the way we live. And you know what? This could be a phenomenal journey if we decide to change direction. One of the most exciting, I think, developments, toolkits to help us change direction are the Sustainable Development Goals. 17 global goals agreed through the United Nations to try and change direction. And they look at everything from poverty to hunger, to well-being, to energy, to transport. They cover pretty much everything that we could. It's a great roadmap for direction. And within its core is the idea of sustainable development. This idea of our economy, our society, and the natural environment. But not as things that are separate from each other, things that are absolutely interconnected with each other, because there's a very definite hierarchy here. Our economy sits within our society, and our society sits within the natural environment. This is sustainability embedded. This is the way the world works, much as we don't like to admit it. Everything comes from a healthy biosphere. We ignore the idea of clean air, clean water, food, and shelter. If we ignore that basic foundation, we ignore how our species functions in this planet. As I say to people, the worms don't really care about whether the Dow Jones goes up or down. I know it's hugely important to us, but the idea of sustainable consumption, circular economy, changing our way of trading is a key part in the jigsaw towards climate action. And how that economy then functions within our society, how we start to look at things like poverty, hunger, gender equality, education, all of these things are connected to how our society fits within a viable biosphere, within the natural environment. Clean water, climate action, living creatures on land and in the water. Collectively, this is the blueprint for a new type of world. And in truth, I think it's really exciting. It's a really exciting journey to be a part of. But if we don't take this journey, if we don't embed ideas like sustainability, we really are on a cul-de-sac journey. We need to transform our society because the biosphere is the precondition for social justice, economic development, and long-term sustainability for our species. So folks, thank you very much. I hope that talk was of interest to you. We've got a bit of time, I think, for questions, so I'll just hand back over to Sinead.
Thank you so much, Gavin. Really, really interesting presentation. And if I may, just before we go to questions and answers, I should have mentioned this at the beginning. We need to thank Adair Tidy Towns. Adair Tidy Towns, this was actually their workshop that they are meant to do in real physical time, if you like, with your good self out in Adair. and due to COVID, that wasn't obviously a possibility. You did a wonderful workshop for us just before COVID happened, actually, back in February. So I'd like to thank Adair Tidy Towns for allowing us to harness this workshop as part of our Greenleaf series. And I know that the chair of our Tidy Towns is in the audience there tonight. Now, if we go over to questions and answers, or questions then, our first question is, hi Gavin, thank you so much for your time. I was wondering, could I ask about the development of an interpretive centre to engage the public with climate change and sustainable development? What are your views on this type of, or this form of education? As an environmental educator that's currently doing research on this topic, I find that there's a big emphasis on one-off public engagement experience, and Sinead, this is another Sinead, wonders if maybe a physical structure, I suppose, would help engage the public more and bring together various environmental networks in one central area. And this would be, I suppose, between the city and the county. So she's obviously speaking specifically about Limerick. Would you have any views, Gavin?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no shortage of things to do, in all truth, and something like that would be a part of the jigsaw. I think the missing ingredient, as I see it, I mean, yes, the projects, there's no shortage of projects. What's missing is the cultural, I suppose, drive to want to do this. So our politicians, our entrepreneurs, our captains of industry, our banks, our investors, people with the ideas to make things happen, they don't seem to be turning up. They're not at the races yet for this type of story. So absolutely, that and more is what is needed. What's missing is the cultural story to make it happen. If I was to use an analogy, in America, if we track the trajectory of smoking, for example, over 100 years, it wasn't until the science came out and basically was, produced the evidence that told people that smoking was bad for your health, that we saw the behavior change start to occur. A mass movement of people gathered around it and behavior changed. In a similar way, we need to embrace the science, the consensus on climate, and hopefully draw all parties, all people together to work together for this action. We're not at that place yet. So Sinead, if you can start something up like that, go for it, is what I would say, and get more people involved to help you with it.
Very good. Sinead is also wondering if there's any places where she could actually learn to give presentations specifically like this one. Obviously a very keen environmentalist.
I understand that the up in Powers Court there is the Cool Earth. I think they train people up to give presentations like that, and I think that is a sort of a visitor centre that's operating up in Wicklow for people to go and do something like that. So that's something that is there in Ireland, moving in this direction already.
That's good to know. We have a question in from Sarah, who's age 9.5, and Sarah would like to know, how many years will it take us to slow down our CO2 numbers?
Sarah, that is a difficult question to answer. I would love to say that we'd start doing it tomorrow. I don't think that is the truth. I think, Sarah, you have a really important part in this. I think making your voice heard and informing adults, because in truth, we're not doing it. This is a chance for you to say, grown-ups, start doing this. And literally, you have an important voice here. So let people hear it, and great you're here. And I'd love to say we're doing it now, but we're not. Okay? So bad homework for grown-ups.
Yeah. And just on that note, Gavin, I think it's fair to say that COVID did impact on the young people's movement around climate change. And I have to say that some of my best days working in the council, some of the most uplifting days, I suppose, were to see the climate action protests that young people brought to City Hall. They were well attended, they were well organised, they were very respectful of everybody around them, but they got the message across that we need to do more, and we need not leave everything to them to try and fix, like by continuing on the same path. And I think a lot of people heard it then, and I do think that that's one aspect of where, well, there's many aspects where COVID has changed our lives, but that's one aspect that it's a real pity, because I think it did impact on young people and their means of communicating, if you like.
Just on the plus side there, Sinead, I do know that the Youth Movement for Climate Action is running a mock COP. So if take a look at that on the internet, take a look for mock COP. It's been cancelled. The UN conference has been cancelled in Glasgow this year due to COVID. But the kids are saying that's not good enough, and they're actually running their own global conference starting in about a week's time, and that's going to be an online affair. And I think if you're a young person, get in there, get involved, be part of that story, because the adults have decided to take a break this year, but the kids are doing it. So again, get in there, make your voice heard. It's an opportunity to move online if you can't go on the streets.
Very good. And we have another question in from Sarah. Should we be using wearable devices to calculate our usage every day? Smart wearable devices.
Yeah, I think if that helps you, absolutely. But I think we know already, the kind of stuff. I mean, I say to people, the easy wins in this are things like diet, things like waste, They are the places that you can actually win in transport. So get to your bicycle, eat less meat, and watch what you throw out and what you buy. You don't need a smart technology solution to kind of to change your lifestyle, and it's actually healthier, by the way. It's also better for you. So taking on some of these kind of climate actions will make you a healthier and, I think, happier person.
The My Waste, the National My Waste site, is a very good site for further information on managing your waste. As Gavin just mentioned, managing waste there specifically, and obviously prevention, reuse, all of those things. And I'll bet you Sarah and her school, I'm sure, are doing great on that, because I see a couple of green schools there as well. Gavin, if I can just go to the chat, wonderful presentation, very clear from Dolores. Thanks a million, Gavin, from Sinead Jackson. Really wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Made it very clear and definite, very easy to understand. These are all the things we want to be able to do, and we're very grateful for Gavin to getting climate change and climate action across in this manner, that people feel they understand it more. Sorry, now we have more questions coming in. One from John. On the 97% of consensus, would you care to expand on the source of this? Any sources to back up that 97% consensus of scientists that actually believe in climate change?
Oh yeah, there's multiple versions of that. So yeah, that's not in dispute. Take a look yourself, John. It's all over the place. So there is no doubt about that. It's well tested by numerous lines of study. So there is no question around it.
Okay. And then from Moira, well, it's more a comment than a question, I suppose. We really need our governments to be stronger. COVID has allowed the population to respect nature, but maybe not enough. Moira's very concerned about biodiversity reductions, and just a reminder to us all that sound bites at times aren't really good enough, either from the government or from anybody else, and that's where we need to be careful as well. I think sometimes with our social media usage, it's very easy to click a button and give support. It's another thing to get out there and walk instead of use the car or whatever it might be. All right, so I think that's all we have 2 new messages in, Gavin, just if you could bear with us.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful presentation, Gavin, easy to relate to. Thank you very much. That's great talk, Gavin, well done. It's all very positive, Gavin, so thank you so much.
Well, my pleasure. I enjoy doing it, so
and Sinead, who was the environmental educator who asked all those questions in the early part, has said, just come in with a comment. She'll be doing a number of actions in UL later this week, in the next number of weeks. So that's fantastic. So I would like to thank you all very much for your time. Both to all our participants and obviously especially to you, Gavin, and to Adair Tidy Towns. And our next webinar is on green procurement. It's a daytime webinar. It's next Tuesday, the 17th of November, 10:30 to 12 o'clock. And all the details are on limerick.ie. Thanks so much, Gavin. Okay, good night, everybody.
God bless. Good night.